I watched through the one-way glass as Marcus drooled into his hospital gown, his eyes unfocused and vacant. The doctor beside me shook his head gravely. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Chen. The cognitive decline is irreversible. He'll need permanent institutional care." I pressed my hand to the glass, letting a single tear roll down my cheek for effect. Inside, I was smiling, because I knew something none of these doctors knew. Marcus was faking every bit of it, and I was going to make sure his little performance became his permanent reality. Let me take you back to where this all began, to the moment I discovered my husband of 8 years was not the man I thought he was. But to truly understand, you need to know about my family first. I was born Lily Zhang, the youngest daughter in a family that valued sons above all else. My older sister Victoria was everything my parents wanted: beautiful, charming, and ruthless. She was 5 years older than me and never let me forget it. My mother, Susan, had been a socialite in Shanghai before marrying my father, and she'd brought all her cruelty and social climbing instincts to America. My father, Richard, was a successful real estate developer who barely acknowledged my existence unless it was to compare me unfavorably to Victoria. Growing up, I was the invisible child. Victoria got piano lessons with the city's best instructor. I got a used keyboard from Goodwill. Victoria got a BMW for her 16th birthday. I got a bus pass. When I made straight A's, it was expected and ignored. When Victoria scraped by with C's, she was praised for trying her best and having more important social skills. But the worst part wasn't the material differences, it was the constant emotional warfare. Victoria was a master manipulator, and she'd learned from the best, our mother. Together, they made my childhood a living hell of backhanded compliments, public humiliations, and gaslighting so severe I questioned my own sanity. When I was 14, I overheard a conversation that changed everything. I'd come home early from school, and my mother and Victoria were having tea in the living room. I paused at the door when I heard my name. "Lily is so plain," Victoria said, her voice dripping with false concern. "Do you think she'll ever find a husband?" My mother laughed, that tinkling, cruel laugh I knew so well. "Darling, we can only hope she finds someone desperate enough. At least she's smart. Maybe she can marry some ugly doctor who needs someone to manage his practice." "She's useful, I suppose," Victoria replied. "When I marry Thomas, I'll need someone to handle the boring charity work." Lily would be perfect for that, invisible and competent. Thomas was Victoria's boyfriend at the time, heir to a pharmaceutical fortune. They'd been dating for 2 years, and the wedding was already being planned, even though they were only 21 and 19, respectively. That conversation planted a seed of something dark in my heart. But I was powerless then, just a 14-year-old girl with no resources and no allies. So I did what I had always done. I survived. I studied, I kept my head down, and I waited. Then when I was 17, something extraordinary happened. I died. It was a car accident. Victoria had been driving, texting Thomas when she ran a red light. The last thing I remembered from that life was the sound of screeching tires and Victoria screaming. Then nothing. When I woke up, I was 14 again, standing in that same hallway, about to overhear that same conversation. But this time, I remembered everything. 3 years of abuse yet to come, and something even more important. I remembered how it all ended. In my previous life, I'd gone to college on a full scholarship, grateful to escape my family. I'd studied business and accounting, practical subjects that would ensure I'd never be dependent on anyone. I'd met Marcus Chen in my senior year. He'd been charming, attentive, and most importantly, he'd seemed to see me, really see me, in a way no one ever had. He'd been a junior architect at a small firm, handsome in an understated way, with kind eyes and a gentle manner. After years of my family's cruelty, his kindness felt like water in a desert. We married 6 months after graduation, a small ceremony that my family barely attended. Victoria had made a snide comment about how desperate I must have been to settle so quickly. For the first 2 years, Marcus had been everything I dreamed of. He supported my career in accounting, encouraged me when I wanted to start my own consulting firm, and seemed genuinely proud of my successes. We bought a small house in the suburbs, talked about having children someday, and I finally felt like I'd escaped my family's shadow. But in year 3, things began to change. Marcus started working late more often. He became distant, distracted. He'd forget our anniversary, then our birthdays. He'd snap at me over small things, then apologize profusely. I'd chalked it up to stress at work. His firm was competing for a major contract. Then came the diagnosis that changed everything. Marcus had come home one evening, his face grave. "Lily, I need to tell you something. I went to the doctor today because I've been having headaches and memory problems. They found a brain tumor." My world had shattered. The doctors said it was inoperable but slow growing. They gave him 5 to 10 years. I'd devoted myself to his care, putting my business on hold, spending our savings on experimental treatments and specialists. Meanwhile, my family had circled like vultures. Victoria had divorced Thomas after it came out that he'd been embezzling from his own family's company. She'd walked away with nothing, her social standing destroyed. My mother had stood by her, of course, and together they'd turned their attention to me. They'd needed money, and I was the only one with any. My consulting firm had been successful before Marcus's illness, and we'd saved considerably. They'd started with small requests, a loan here, help with a bill there, but it had escalated. They'd wanted me to take out a second mortgage to fund Victoria's business venture. They'd wanted me to co-sign loans they'd had no intention of repaying, and like a fool, I'd done it. Because despite everything, they were my family, and Marcus had encouraged it. "Family is important, Lily," he'd said, his eyes sad and distant. "Don't let them go. You'll regret it when I'm gone." The end had come when I was 26. Marcus's condition had deteriorated rapidly. He'd become confused, aggressive, unable to care for himself. The doctors had recommended institutional care. I'd resisted, wanting to keep him home, but eventually I'd had no choice. The night before he was supposed to be admitted to a long-term care facility, Victoria had come to me with a proposal. She'd found a lawyer who could have Marcus declared incompetent, allowing her to be appointed as his guardian instead of me. In exchange for me signing over our house and remaining savings, she'd let me visit him once a month. I'd refused, of course. But I'd been too late. My father had used his connections. My mother had gotten affidavits from doctors she'd bribed, and Victoria had somehow produced a power of attorney that Marcus had supposedly signed before his decline. I'd lost everything, the house, the savings, even my right to see my own husband. I'd been left with nothing but debt. All those loans I'd co-signed, all those obligations they'd piled on me. In desperation, I'd started investigating. And that's when I'd found it. The truth that had destroyed me in my previous life. Marcus had never been sick. There was no brain tumor. It had all been an elaborate con orchestrated by my own family. Marcus had been having an affair with Victoria for over a year. The illness had been a way to drain my resources while keeping me trapped and compliant. The end game had been to have me declared an unfit spouse, take everything I'd built, and leave me with nothing. I'd confronted them at what was supposed to be Marcus's care facility, but instead of my ailing husband, I'd found him perfectly healthy, laughing with Victoria in a room they'd rented to keep up appearances. The shock had been too much. I'd stood there, my mind breaking, as they'd explained it all with smug satisfaction. How they'd researched symptoms, bribed doctors, forged medical records. How Marcus had been in on it from the start. He'd specifically targeted me, the invisible daughter with no allies, building up my trust over years just to tear me down. "You were always so pathetic," Victoria had said, examining her nails. "It was so desperate to be loved. Marcus didn't even have to try hard." I'd left that building and walked into traffic. I'd wanted it to be an accident, but looking back, I think some part of me just gave up. The impact had killed me instantly, and then I'd woken up at 14 with a second chance. This time, I knew the truth. I knew Marcus was a con artist. I knew my family would betray me at every turn. And most importantly, I knew exactly how their plan worked. But I also knew something they didn't. I knew every detail of their scheme because I'd lived through it once. I knew every move they would make before they made it. I had the ultimate advantage, foreknowledge. So I'd waited. I'd endured 3 more years of my family's abuse, but this time I'd been preparing. I'd documented everything, every snide comment, every time my mother chose Victoria over me, every instance of my father's neglect. I'd kept journals, taken photos, recorded conversations. I'd built a case file of abuse that would make any jury weep. I'd also prepared financially. Using knowledge from my previous life, I'd invested the small amounts of money I could earn from tutoring and odd jobs. I'd bought stock in companies I knew would boom, cryptocurrency before it was mainstream, and I'd hidden it all in accounts my family knew nothing about. By the time I was 18 and heading to college, I had over $200,000 in assets they couldn't touch. But I'd kept living like poor little Lily, grateful for their scraps, so they never suspected. I'd gone to the same college, majored in the same subjects, but this time I'd double majored in psychology as well. I'd needed to understand manipulation, gaslighting, and, most importantly, how to document and prove it. And then I'd waited for Marcus. He'd appeared right on schedule in my senior year at the same coffee shop where we'd accidentally bumped into each other before. But this time, I'd known it wasn't an accident. I'd known he'd been watching me, studying me, confirming I was the perfect mark. I'd let him court me. I'd let him be charming and attentive. I'd let him think he was winning me over. But this time, I was the one playing a game. I'd hired a private investigator before our third date. By the time Marcus proposed, I had a complete dossier on him. His real name, Marcus Williams, not Chen. His criminal record, multiple counts of fraud under different identities, and most importantly, his connection to my family. It turned out Victoria had met him at a bar 2 years earlier, shortly after her marriage to Thomas had started falling apart. She'd been immediately attracted to him, but more than that, she'd seen an opportunity. She'd told him all about her pathetic little sister, the ugly duckling with a surprising talent for making money, who was so desperate for love she'd believe anything. Together, they'd crafted the perfect long con. Marcus would seduce me, marry me, let me build a business and save money, and then fake a terminal illness to drain everything. Victoria would swoop in at the end to help, and they'd split everything 50-50. My mother and father were aware of the scheme and approved. They'd get a cut too, and they'd finally be rid of their embarrassing younger daughter. Knowing all this, I'd said yes when Marcus proposed. The wedding was small, just like before. My family barely attended, just like before. But this time, I'd hired videographers to catch every snide comment, every moment of their disdain. I was building my evidence. The first 2 years of marriage proceeded almost exactly as they had in my previous life. Marcus was attentive and kind, playing his part perfectly. I played mine too, the grateful wife, the hard worker, the woman so in love she was blind to any red flags. But behind the scenes, I was preparing. I'd launched my consulting firm just like before, but this time I'd structured it differently. I'd set up multiple LLCs, offshore accounts, and trusts that would be virtually impossible to seize or claim in any kind of settlement. Every asset was protected, every account traceable only to me. I'd also done something else. I'd befriended every single person who'd testified against me in my previous life, who'd helped my family steal my assets. I'd cultivated relationships with the doctors, the lawyers, the judges. I'd donated to their charities, attended their galas, become a pillar of the community. When Marcus's illness was supposed to begin, I was ready. It started exactly as it had before. He came home with complaints of headaches and memory problems. He suggested seeing a doctor. I'd agreed, even driven him to the appointment. But this time, I'd chosen the doctor, my doctor, one I'd been seeing for years, who knew me well and trusted me implicitly. When Marcus tried to describe his symptoms that perfectly matched a slow-growing brain tumor, Dr. Patricia Morrison had run every test imaginable. MRIs, CT scans, blood work, neurological exams, all of which I'd insisted on, playing the worried wife. All of which came back completely normal. "Mr. Chen, I can't find anything wrong," Dr. Morrison had said, confusion evident in her voice. "Your brain is perfectly healthy." I'd watched Marcus's face carefully. He'd hidden it well, but I'd seen the flash of panic, the quick calculation. "But the headaches," he'd insisted. "The memory problems. Sometimes I can't remember entire conversations." Dr. Morrison had suggested stress, recommended therapy, prescribed some mild pain medication for the headaches. Marcus had left that appointment frustrated, and I'd known he was scrambling to adjust his plan. That night, I'd found him on the phone in his car. I'd planted a recording device there a couple weeks earlier, and I'd listened to his conversation with Victoria. "She took me to her own doctor," Marcus had hissed. "Everything came back normal. I can't fake test results." Then we need to escalate, Victoria had replied. Start acting more confused. Have a seizure or something. We'll find a different doctor, one we can control. What if she suspects? Victoria had laughed. Lily, please, she's so desperate to believe you love her. She'd believe you if you told her you were a werewolf. Just keep playing the devoted husband. We've invested 3 years in this. We're not stopping now. 3 years. In my original timeline, the illness had started in year 3. This time, I derailed their plan by 2 months, throwing off their carefully calculated timeline. Good. Over the next few weeks, Marcus had indeed escalated. He'd started forgetting things, conversations we'd had, appointments he'd made, even my birthday. He'd had what he claimed was a seizure, collapsing in our kitchen and convulsing dramatically. I'd called 911, played the terrified wife, but I'd also made sure to video the entire thing from multiple angles. Our security cameras, which Marcus didn't know I'd upgraded, had caught everything in HD. The paramedics had found nothing wrong. The ER doctors had found nothing wrong. Another round of tests, all normal, but Marcus had persisted. His symptoms had gotten worse. Confusion, disorientation, personality changes. He'd started being cruel to me, then apologizing tearfully, claiming he wasn't himself. This was all part of the plan I'd known. Make me doubt him, make me want the old Marcus back, make me so desperate to help him that I'd agree to anything. And that's when my family had re-entered the picture. Victoria had called one day, her voice dripping with false concern. Lily, Mom told me about Marcus. I'm so sorry. I know we haven't always been close, but you're my sister. I want to help. That's kind of you, I'd said carefully. I have a friend, a neurologist at Johns Hopkins. Top of his field, I can get Marcus an appointment next week. There it was, the controlled doctor, the one who would give the diagnosis they needed. Thank you, Victoria. That means so much. I'd let Marcus go to that appointment. I'd even gone with him playing the supportive wife. And like clockwork, this Dr. Richard Thornton had found exactly what Marcus wanted him to find. Mrs. Chen, I'm afraid I have difficult news, he'd said gravely. Your husband has a rare form of frontotemporal dementia. It's aggressive and degenerative. The prognosis is not good. Marcus had looked appropriately devastated. I'd cried on cue. Dr. Thornton had prescribed various medications and suggested we start planning for long-term care needs. But I'd also noticed something. Dr. Thornton had barely looked at Marcus's actual test results from the other hospitals. His diagnosis had been based almost entirely on Marcus's self-reported symptoms and a cursory examination. Over the next months, I'd played along perfectly. I'd watched as Marcus's condition deteriorated. I'd watched as my family slowly increased their presence in my life, offering help and support. My mother had moved into our guest room temporarily to help care for Marcus. Victoria had started managing our finances, supposedly to take the burden off me. My father had connected me with lawyers to protect our assets. Every single move was exactly as it had been in my previous life. They thought they were following their perfect plan, but I was following mine. See, while they were busy manipulating me, I was busy documenting everything. Every time Marcus forgot something conveniently, like the prenup I'd asked him to sign, which he'd suddenly had no memory of, I had it on video. Every conversation with Victoria about moving money around, recorded. Every instruction from my mother about how to prepare for the worst, saved and backed up. I'd also hired a team of private investigators. Not just one, but 5 different firms, none of whom knew about the others. They'd uncovered everything. The burner phones Marcus used to coordinate with Victoria, the offshore account where they were planning to stash my money, even the villa in Costa Rica they'd already put a deposit on for their new life together. But I hadn't moved yet. I'd been waiting for the right moment, the moment when they would be most committed, most exposed, most vulnerable. That moment came when Victoria produced the power of attorney. She'd called a family meeting at my house. Marcus had been having a good day, one of his rare moments of clarity, she'd said. My mother, father, Victoria, and even Victoria's lawyer had been there. Lily, we need to talk about Marcus's care, Victoria had started. His condition is deteriorating rapidly. Dr. Thornton believes he needs institutional care now. I can take care of him at home, I'd protested, right on script. You're not a trained nurse, my mother had snapped. You're being selfish, Lily. Marcus needs professional help. I found an excellent facility, my father had added. Full-time care, the best doctors, but it's expensive. I'll pay for it, I'd said immediately. It's not that simple, Victoria's lawyer had interjected. Mr. Chen's condition means he can no longer make medical or financial decisions for himself. We need someone with power of attorney to act on his behalf. I'm his wife, and you're too emotionally compromised, Victoria had interrupted. Lily, I know this is hard, but we need to think about what's best for Marcus. I've been working with Dr. Thornton. I understand his condition. I can make the hard decisions you can't. That's when she'd produced the document, a power of attorney signed by Marcus during one of his lucid moments, giving Victoria complete control over his medical and financial affairs. I'd looked at Marcus. He'd been slumped in his wheelchair, drool running down his chin, eyes unfocused. The picture of a man in severe cognitive decline? Perfect. Okay, I'd said quietly, defeated. If it's what's best for Marcus. I'd seen the triumph flash across Victoria's face, quickly hidden. My mother had reached over to pat my hand condescendingly. My father had nodded approvingly. They thought they'd won. They had no idea they'd just walked into my trap. That night, I'd activated the final phase of my plan. First, I'd called Dr. Morrison and told her everything. My family's history of abuse, Marcus's sudden illness, my suspicions about Dr. Thornton's diagnosis. I'd shared every piece of evidence I'd collected. The recordings, the videos, the private investigator reports. She'd been horrified. Lily, if what you're telling me is true, this is fraud on a massive scale. We need to report this. I will, I'd assured her. But first, I need one more piece of evidence. I need to prove Marcus is faking. That's when I'd told her my plan. The next day, I'd called Victoria, my voice shaking. Something's happened. Marcus had another seizure last night, a bad one. I called 911 and they took him to County General. The doctors there, they're saying things don't add up. They want to transfer him to the psychiatric unit for evaluation. County General was a massive public hospital, notorious for its underfunded psychiatric ward. It was the kind of place that once you were admitted to the psych unit, you didn't get out easily. The staff was overworked, the patients were genuinely dangerous, and the conditions were medieval. I'd heard Victoria's sharp intake of breath. The psychiatric unit? No, we need to get him out of there. We need to transfer him to the facility we chose. They won't let me, I'd sobbed, because I'm not his power of attorney anymore. Victoria, you have to help. You have to authorize his transfer. I'll be right there. But Victoria had arrived to find something unexpected. The doctors at County General, briefed by Dr. Morrison and presented with all my evidence, had been very interested in Marcus's case. They'd run their own tests, conducted their own evaluations, and they'd found exactly what I'd known they would find: a perfectly healthy man pretending to be mentally incompetent. Ms. Zhang, the head psychiatrist, Dr. Elena Rodriguez, had said to Victoria, "We have some concerns about your brother-in-law's diagnosis. His symptoms don't match any known pattern of frontotemporal dementia. In fact, his symptoms don't match any organic brain disease at all." "What are you suggesting?" Victoria had demanded. "We believe Mr. Chen may be malingering, faking his symptoms, but we also believe he may have genuine psychiatric issues that require treatment. The stress of his deception may have triggered a real psychotic break." This was the brilliant part of my plan. I couldn't just expose Marcus as a fraud. That would lead to criminal charges, sure, but also a trial, media attention, and the possibility that a sympathetic jury might go easy on him. No, I needed something more permanent. If Marcus was declared genuinely mentally ill, if his faking was reframed as a symptom of actual mental illness, he could be involuntarily committed. And once someone was committed to the psychiatric system, especially someone who insisted they were faking, it was almost impossible to get out. Because the more you insisted you were sane, the more it sounded like denial of your condition. "This is ridiculous," Victoria had sputtered. "I'm removing him from this facility immediately." "I'm afraid you can't," Dr. Rodriguez had said calmly. Mr. Chen is currently on a 72-hour psychiatric hold. During that time, he'll undergo comprehensive evaluation. If we determine he's a danger to himself or others, we can petition for extended involuntary commitment. On what grounds? On the grounds that he's been deliberately inducing seizures in himself, taking medications he doesn't need, and engaging in behavior designed to make himself appear mentally incompetent. All of which suggests severe psychiatric disturbance. I'd stepped forward then, my face a mask of concern. Victoria, maybe we should let them help him. If Marcus is that confused, maybe he does need psychiatric care. The look Victoria had given me was pure venom, but she'd been trapped. If she insisted Marcus was sane, she'd be admitting the whole thing was a fraud. If she agreed he needed psychiatric care, she'd be cementing his commitment. She'd chosen the latter, probably planning to extract him later once things calmed down, but things weren't going to calm down. Over the next 72 hours, Marcus had been evaluated by multiple psychiatrists. And here's the thing about Marcus. He'd been playing at mental illness for so long, he'd actually developed some real symptoms. The constant stress of maintaining his act, combined with the cognitive dissonance of his deception, had created genuine psychological problems. Dr. Rodriguez had called it factitious disorder imposed on oneself with secondary psychiatric complications. In layman's terms, Marcus had faked illness so convincingly that he'd made himself actually sick. The evaluation reports were damning. Marcus had shown signs of dissociative episodes, narcissistic personality disorder, and antisocial tendencies. He'd been manipulative with staff, alternating between playing sick and becoming aggressive when he thought no one was watching. He'd been caught on security cameras having perfectly normal conversations with other patients, then immediately resuming his confused act when staff approached. All of which supported my narrative. Marcus wasn't just a con artist, he was genuinely mentally ill. The hospital had petitioned for extended commitment. I testified at the hearing, tearfully describing my husband's deterioration, how he'd become someone I didn't recognize, how frightened I was of him. I'd brought in Dr. Morrison, who'd testified about the inconsistencies in his symptoms. I'd brought in the private investigators who'd presented evidence of his fraud. I'd even brought in a forensic psychiatrist who'd reviewed all the evidence and concluded that Marcus represented a danger to himself and others due to his severe delusional disorder and antisocial behaviors. The judge had granted the petition. Marcus had been committed to the state psychiatric hospital indefinitely, and that's when things got really interesting. See, Victoria had immediately tried to fight the commitment. She'd hired lawyers, filed motions, demanded reevaluations, but every attempt backfired spectacularly because I'd leaked everything to the media. The story was perfect for the news cycle. Society architect and socialite plot elaborate con to defraud innocent wife. My team had packaged it beautifully. I was the sympathetic victim, the loyal wife who'd discovered her husband's betrayal. Marcus and Victoria were the villains, the cruel schemers who'd targeted a vulnerable woman. The private investigator reports, the recordings, the videos, I'd released them all. Marcus admitting the con to Victoria. Victoria laughing about my patheticism. My mother casually discussing how to divide my assets. My father advising on how to forge documents. The public had been outraged. The state bar had opened investigations into Victoria's lawyer. Dr. Thornton from Johns Hopkins had been suspended pending review of his diagnosis. My family had become social pariahs overnight. And Marcus? Poor Marcus had found himself in a genuine nightmare. The state psychiatric hospital where he'd been committed was underfunded and overcrowded. The staff was overworked and had little sympathy for a man who'd been exposed as a con artist in the media. His insistence that he was perfectly sane and had just been faking was viewed as exactly what you'd expect from someone with his diagnosed conditions, denial of his illness. Every time he'd acted normal, it was documented as superficial charm consistent with antisocial personality disorder. Every time he'd gotten angry or frustrated, it was noted as poor emotional regulation and impulse control. Every time he tried to explain that it had all been an act, he was exhibiting delusional thinking and lack of insight into his condition. The more he'd tried to prove he was sane, the crazier he'd looked. I'd visited him once, about a month into his commitment. I'd wanted to see it for myself. They'd brought him into the visiting room in a standard issue psychiatric facility uniform, his hair unkempt, his eyes wild. A far cry from the polished architect I'd married. "Lily," he'd said desperately, rushing toward me. An orderly had grabbed his arm, holding him back. "Lily, please, you have to tell them. Tell them I was faking. Tell them I'm not crazy." I'd looked at him with wide, sad eyes. "Marcus, the doctors say you're confused. They say you need help." "I was conning you," he'd shouted. "Don't you understand? It was all fake. The illness, the seizures, everything." The orderlies had tensed, ready to restrain him if necessary. "You see," I'd said softly to the supervising psychiatrist who'd been monitoring the visit, "he's having another episode where he confabulates this elaborate story. It's so hard to see him like this." "We're adjusting his medications, Mrs. Chen," the psychiatrist had assured me. "These delusions should diminish with proper treatment." Marcus had looked at me then, really looked at me, and I'd seen the moment he understood. His face had gone pale. "It's you," he'd whispered. "This is you. You knew the whole time." I'd leaned forward, dropping my voice so only he could hear. "I died once because of you and my family. Did you really think I'd let it happen again?" His expression had shifted from confusion to horror to rage in seconds. He'd lunged at me, hands outstretched, screaming incoherently. The orderlies had tackled him immediately, forcing him down, calling for sedatives. I'd stumbled back, playing terrified, letting them see me shake. "I'm so sorry you had to see that," the psychiatrist had said, guiding me out while Marcus was being forcibly medicated behind us. "The aggressive episodes are becoming more frequent. We're considering moving him to the secure unit." The secure unit, where the violent patients were kept behind multiple locked doors with even less freedom and even more medication. "If you think that's best," I'd whispered, "I'd never visit it again." But Victoria had tried. Oh, Victoria had tried everything to get Marcus out. She'd hired the best lawyers money could buy, except she'd had no money because I'd made sure of that too. Remember all those loans I'd co-signed in my previous life? This time, I'd signed nothing. Remember how my family had tried to claim my assets? This time, everything was locked up tighter than Fort Knox. And I'd gone on offense. I'd sued Victoria for attempted fraud, presenting all my evidence in civil court. I'd sued my parents for emotional distress and conspiracy, documenting years of abuse. I'd sued Dr. Thornton for medical malpractice and Victoria's lawyer for conspiracy to commit fraud. Each lawsuit was designed not necessarily to win, though I did win most of them, but to drain their resources, to keep them in court, to make their lives a living hell of depositions and legal fees and public humiliation. Victoria had lost everything: her apartment, her car, her social standing. The friends who'd once fawned over her had vanished overnight. No one wanted to be associated with the woman who'd tried to con her own sister. She'd had to move back in with our parents, which had been its own special hell for her. Because I'd ensured our parents lost their money too. The lawsuits, the legal fees, the revelations about my father's shady business practices that just happened to come out during discovery, it all added up. They'd lost their house, their social standing, everything. They'd been forced to move into a small apartment in a bad part of town. My father's business had collapsed. My mother's social circle had abandoned her. And the best part? They'd all blamed each other. Victoria blamed our parents for not protecting her better. Our mother blamed Victoria for being careless enough to get caught. Our father blamed everyone for ruining his reputation. I'd watched from afar as my family tore itself apart, each one clawing at the others in their desperation. It was everything they deserved. Meanwhile, my life had flourished. My consulting firm had exploded in success, partly because of the publicity. I'd been cast as the brave woman who'd overcome family abuse and spousal betrayal, and clients had flocked to me. I'd been interviewed on national television, had written a best-selling book about financial abuse and recovery, had become a sought-after speaker on the topic. The accounts I'd hidden, the investments I'd made had grown exponentially. I was wealthier than my parents had ever been. I lived in a beautiful penthouse in the city, wore designer clothes, drove a Tesla. But more than that, I was free. Free from my family's expectations and cruelty. Free from Marcus's manipulation. Free from the fear that had haunted my entire first life. I'd also met someone new. Daniel was a corporate attorney, successful in his own right, who'd been attracted to my strength rather than my vulnerability. He didn't want to save me or fix me. He liked me exactly as I was. Sharp, driven, and unapologetically successful. We'd married in a lavish ceremony 2 years after Marcus's commitment. It was everything my first wedding hadn't been. Elegant, joyful, attended by people who genuinely cared about me. Not a single member of my original family received an invitation, but I'd made sure they knew about it. I'd hired a publicist to leak photos to the tabloids, ensuring Victoria would see them on every newsstand. My mother would see me in my custom Vera Wang gown, looking radiant and happy. My father would see the guest list full of influential people, people who'd once courted his favor and now wouldn't give him the time of day. And Marcus? I'd sent him a wedding announcement, addressed to him at the state psychiatric hospital. I'd like to think he was lucid enough to understand what it meant, that I'd moved on, that I'd won, that he'd spend the rest of his life locked away while I lived in luxury. But honestly, I didn't care if he understood or not. He was irrelevant now, just another ghost from a life I'd left behind. Daniel and I honeymooned in Bali for a month. When we returned, we bought a house in the suburbs, not the small starter home Marcus and I had shared, but a genuine mansion with 6 bedrooms, a pool, and grounds that required a gardener. We talked about having children. I'd never had them in my first life, had never felt safe enough to bring another person into my unstable world. But now with Daniel, I felt ready. I felt like I could give a child the kind of loving, supportive home I'd never had. Life was perfect. Better than perfect. It was everything I'd dreamed of during those dark years of my first life. Everything I'd fought for in my second chance, but I wasn't done with my family yet. 3 years after Marcus's commitment, I received a call from the state psychiatric hospital. It was Dr. Rodriguez, the psychiatrist who'd first evaluated Marcus. "Mrs. Chen, or I suppose it's Mrs. Patterson now," she said. "I'm calling about your former husband. His condition has deteriorated significantly." "Oh?" I kept my voice carefully neutral. The years of involuntary medication, combined with the stress of confinement and his underlying psychiatric conditions, have resulted in genuine cognitive decline. He's developed what we call institutionalization syndrome, a very real mental deterioration that occurs in long-term psychiatric patients. I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. "You're saying he's actually mentally ill now?" "I'm saying that whatever he was when he came to us, he's not the same person now. The brain is a delicate organ, Miss Patterson. 3 years of antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, and the trauma of involuntary confinement have changed him fundamentally. He has difficulty distinguishing reality from delusion. His cognitive function has genuinely declined. In a very real sense, the condition he was faking has become his actual condition." "How ironic," I said softly. "Indeed. I'm calling because we need to update his medical proxy information. You're no longer his wife, and his original power of attorney, your sister, has been legally barred from acting on his behalf due to the fraud conviction." Oh yes, Victoria had been convicted. Not of attempted fraud against me, that had been a civil suit, but of actual fraud related to the forged power of attorney. She'd served 18 months in a minimum security prison and was now living in a halfway house working as a barista at a coffee shop downtown. I'd gone to visit her there once, anonymously, just to see. She'd looked haggard, worn down, a shadow of the beautiful socialite she'd once been. Her hands had trembled as she made lattes for customers who didn't recognize her, didn't know she'd once been someone. I'd ordered a coffee from her, met her eyes, and watched the recognition dawn. The fear, the shame, the hatred, all of it playing across her face in an instant. "Extra hot," I'd said pleasantly, "and make sure it's perfect. I'd hate to have to complain to your manager." She'd made my coffee in silence, her jaw clenched, and I'd left a $100 tip. The ultimate insult. Here's some charity, little sister, from someone who has so much they can throw it away on a coffee. "What happens to Marcus now?" I asked Dr. Rodriguez. "Without a medical proxy, the state becomes his guardian. He'll likely spend the rest of his life in institutional care. Given his deterioration, he'd be unable to function in normal society even if he were released." "The rest of his life," I repeated. "How long do you think that will be?" It's hard to say. He's only in his mid 30s, so potentially decades. But the medications, the lifestyle, the stress, long term psychiatric patients typically have a shortened life expectancy. I'd estimate perhaps 20 more years, assuming his health doesn't decline further. 20 years. 20 years in that place. Drugged and confused, the very condition he'd faked, now his inescapable reality. It was more than I could have hoped for. Thank you for letting me know, Dr. Rodriguez. There is one more thing, she said hesitantly. He still asks about you sometimes. During his more lucid moments, he talks about you, about how you knew, how you planned it all. The staff thinks it's part of his delusional system, but, I prompted. I've reviewed his case extensively, Mrs. Patterson. I've read all the evidence, all the reports, and I wonder sometimes if he's right. If you did know from the beginning, if this was all part of your plan. I was silent for a long moment. Then I said, Dr. Rodriguez, does it matter? He tried to destroy me, along with my family. Whether I fought back knowingly or unknowingly, the result is the same. He's facing the consequences of his own actions. I suppose that's true, she said quietly. Thank you for your time, Mrs. Patterson. After I hung up, I sat in my home office looking out at the manicured grounds, and I smiled. Did I feel guilty? Not even a little. Marcus had made his choices. Victoria had made hers. My parents had made theirs. They'd all chosen cruelty, chosen greed, chosen to treat me as something less than human. And I'd simply returned the favor with interest. Daniel found me there an hour later, still staring out the window, lost in thought. Hey, he said softly, wrapping his arms around me from behind. You okay? You look a million miles away. I leaned back into his embrace. Just thinking about the past. Want to talk about it? I turned in his arms, looking up at his concerned, loving face. This man who'd chosen me not because I was vulnerable, but because I was strong. Who'd seen my scars and my victories and loved me for all of it. No, I said, the past is dead. I'm more interested in the future. Speaking of which, he said, a smile playing at his lips. I have news. Oh? The adoption agency called. They have a little girl 3 years old who needs a home. They think we'd be perfect for her. My breath caught. We'd been working with an adoption agency for 6 months. After discovering that I couldn't carry a child myself, some complication from the injuries in my first life that had carried over to this one, the doctor said. A little girl? I whispered. Her name is Sophie. She's been in foster care since she was a baby. Her caseworker says she's smart, resilient, but she needs a stable, loving home. She needs parents who understand what it's like to overcome adversity. I thought about my own childhood, the years of neglect and abuse. I thought about the little girl I'd been, desperate for love, for someone to see her and value her. I couldn't save that little girl. She was gone, erased when I'd died and been reborn. But I could save Sophie. I could give her everything I'd never had. When can we meet her? I asked. Tomorrow, if you want. I want. The next day, we drove to the foster home where Sophie was staying. I was nervous, more nervous than I'd been in years. What if she didn't like me? What if I didn't know how to be a good mother? What if I couldn't break the cycle of abuse my own parents had perpetuated? But then we walked into the foster home, and there she was. Sophie was tiny for 3 years old, with dark curls and enormous brown eyes that seemed to hold too much knowledge for such a young child. She was sitting alone in a corner of the playroom while other children played, a worn stuffed rabbit clutched in her arms. She looked up when we entered, and our eyes met, and I saw myself in her, the wariness, the fear of hoping, the defensive hunch of her shoulders. This was a child who'd learned not to expect kindness, who'd built walls to protect herself. I knelt down slowly, bringing myself to her level. Hi, Sophie. My name is Lily. She studied me silently, evaluating, deciding whether I was safe. I like your rabbit, I said. Does he have a name? After a long moment, she whispered, Mr. Hoppy. That's a good name. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small gift I'd brought, a book about a brave little girl who went on adventures. I brought you something. Do you like stories? She nodded slowly. Me too. When I was your age, stories were my favorite thing. They let me imagine all the places I could go, all the things I could be. Can you read to me? Her voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear it. I'd love to. I sat down on the floor next to her, not too close, respecting her space, and opened the book. As I read, I felt her gradually relax, lean slightly closer. By the end of the story, she was pressed against my side, her head resting on my arm. Daniel watched from across the room, and when I looked up at him, his eyes were shining with tears. We started the adoption process that day. It took 6 months of home visits, evaluations, and paperwork. But finally, Sophie came home with us. She was cautious at first, testing boundaries, waiting for the other shoe to drop. She'd been through so much instability in her short life that she didn't believe any home could be permanent. But slowly, day by day, she began to trust. She began to laugh. She began to believe that she was safe, that she was wanted, that she was loved. Watching her blossom was the most healing thing I'd ever experienced. Every time I tucked her in at night and told her I loved her, I was healing the little girl I'd been. Every time I praised her achievements, no matter how small, I was rewriting the script of my own childhood. Sophie would never be compared unfavorably to a sibling. She would never be told she was worthless or ugly or unwanted. She would grow up knowing with absolute certainty that she was cherished. 4 years after Sophie's adoption, we adopted again a 6-year-old boy named Lucas who'd been in the system since he was 4. Then, 3 years after that, a set of twin girls, Emma and Ella, who were 7. Our house was full of noise and laughter and love. Daniel and I were outnumbered and exhausted and blissfully happy. My consulting firm continued to thrive. I'd built it into a multi-million-dollar operation, with offices in 5 cities and a staff of over 50. But I'd also scaled back my personal hours, preferring to spend time with my family. I'd made sure each of our children knew their worth, knew their strength, knew they were capable of anything they set their minds to. But I'd also taught them kindness, empathy, and the importance of standing up against injustice. On Sophie's 10th birthday, she asked me a question that caught me off guard. Mom, Mom, she said, why don't we ever see your parents? My friend Madison sees her grandparents all the time. We were in the kitchen decorating cupcakes for her party. The other kids were in the living room with Daniel watching a movie. I put down my piping bag and looked at my daughter, my beautiful, brilliant, beloved daughter. That's a complicated question, sweetheart. Do you really want to know the answer? She nodded seriously. At 10, Sophie was remarkably mature, thoughtful beyond her years. My parents weren't kind to me when I was growing up, I said carefully. They treated me badly, and they chose to keep treating me badly even when I became an adult. So I made a choice to keep you and your siblings safe by not having them in our lives. Did they hurt you? Her eyes were wide with concern. Yes, not in ways that left bruises you could see, but in ways that hurt just as much. They made me feel like I wasn't good enough, like I didn't matter. But you're amazing, Sophie said fiercely. You're the best mom in the world. They were wrong. I felt tears prick my eyes. Thank you, baby. Yes, they were wrong, and I made sure they couldn't hurt anyone else the way they hurt me. Good, she said with satisfaction. Then after a moment, is that why you and Dad adopted us? Because you knew what it was like to not be wanted? We adopted you because we wanted you, I corrected gently. Because the moment we met each of you, we knew you were meant to be our children. But yes, I think my childhood helped me understand how important it is for children to feel loved and safe. She hugged me fiercely. I love you, Mom. I love you too, Sophie. More than you could ever know. That night, after the party was over and all the kids were in bed, Daniel and I sat on our back porch watching the stars. She asked about your parents today, I told him. He nodded. I figured she would eventually. They all will. Do you think I'm wrong? Keeping them away from the kids? Daniel was quiet for a moment, considering. He knew everything about my past. both lives, though he'd initially thought the rebirth part was metaphorical, a way of expressing how I'd rebuilt my life. I'd never corrected him. No, he said finally. Your parents had their chance with you, and they chose cruelty. They don't get a second chance with our children. You're protecting our kids, Lily. There's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes I wonder if I'm as bad as they are, I admitted quietly. What I did to Marcus, to Victoria? Stop, Daniel said firmly, taking my hand. What you did was defend yourself. You exposed people who were trying to destroy you. That's not the same as what they did. Marcus is spending his life in a psychiatric hospital. Victoria is barely surviving. My parents lost everything. And they would have done the same to you, or worse. They tried to do worse. You just stopped them first. He squeezed my hand. You're not a bad person for protecting yourself, Lily. You're not a bad person for making sure they faced consequences for their actions. What about mercy? I whispered. What about forgiveness? Mercy and forgiveness are for people who are sorry, who want to change. Were any of them sorry? Did any of them ask for forgiveness? I thought about it. In all these years, not one of them had apologized. Victoria still maintained she'd done nothing wrong, that I'd overreacted. My mother had sent one letter, not apologizing, but demanding I help her financially as a daughter should. My father had tried to guilt me through intermediaries, saying I should respect him simply because he was my father. And Marcus? The few communications I'd received from his doctors indicated that even in his deteriorated state, he blamed me for his situation rather than taking responsibility for his own actions. No, I said. None of them were ever sorry. Then you, Yaman, you have nothing to feel guilty about. But I did feel something. Not quite guilt, but a complicated mix of emotions I couldn't fully name. Satisfaction, yes. Justice, certainly. But also a lingering sadness for the family I'd never had. The father who could have been proud of me, the mother who could have loved me, the sister who could have been my friend. I mourned the relationships that had never existed, even as I celebrated their destruction. 10 years after Marcus's commitment, I received word that my father had died. Heart attack, sudden and massive. My mother found him slumped over the kitchen table in their tiny apartment. I didn't attend the funeral, but I did send flowers, an enormous, expensive arrangement that dwarfed all the others. The card read simply, "In memory of what could have been." My mother called me afterward, her voice shaking with rage. "How dare you?" she hissed. "How dare you show up at your father's funeral with your money and your pity?" I didn't show up, I said calmly, Hassan. I sent flowers. That's more than he ever gave me. You killed him. The stress of what you did to this family, it killed him. No, Mother, his own choices killed him. His choice to favor Victoria over me. His choice to participate in a scheme to defraud me. His choice to never, not once, treat me like I mattered. You're a monster, she spat. An ungrateful, cruel monster. You should have what? I interrupted. Never had me? You've made that clear enough. Well, congratulations, Mother. You got your wish. As far as I'm concerned, you never did have me. Goodbye. I hung up and blocked her number. That was the last time I spoke to either of my parents. My mother died 3 years later, bitter and alone in a state-funded nursing home. Victoria was the only one at her funeral. I heard about it through mutual acquaintances, and I felt nothing. No sadness, no relief, just a sort of hollow indifference. The people who'd given me life had never been parents, not really. They'd been obstacles I'd overcome, villains I'd defeated, and now they were simply gone. Victoria tried to reach out after our mother's death. She sent a letter to my office asking to meet, saying we were the only family each other had left. I read the letter once, then fed it through the shredder in my office. Some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt, some relationships aren't worth salvaging, and some people have earned their exile from your life. Marcus outlived both our parents. The psychiatric hospital sent me updates occasionally, as I was still listed as his ex-wife in their records. Each report detailed further decline, more medications, more cognitive deterioration, more time spent in the secure unit. He was barely recognizable as the man I'd married. The charming architect with the kind eyes had been replaced by a shuffling, medicated shell. He'd gained significant weight from the antipsychotics. His hair had gone gray. He moved slowly, spoke slowly when he spoke at all, and spent most of his days in a fog of pharmaceutical haze. The condition he'd faked had consumed him entirely. I never visited him again after that first time. But I did ensure his care continued. I set up a trust that paid for upgrades to his treatment, a private room, better food, access to art therapy programs. Not out of kindness, but because I wanted him to live as long as possible. Death would be mercy. A long, drugged half-life was justice. 23 years after his commitment, I received the final call. Marcus had died of complications from pneumonia. He was 58 years old, but his body was that of a much older man, worn down by decades of psychiatric medications and institutional living. The hospital needed someone to claim his body. As his ex-wife and the only person listed in his file, the responsibility fell to me. I had him cremated, a simple, cheap service. No funeral, no memorial, no ceremony. Then I drove to the coast, to a rocky beach I'd discovered years ago, a place where I sometimes went to think. I stood on the rocks with the small urn in my hands, waves crashing below me. "You could have just left me alone," I said to the ashes. "You could have chosen anyone else to con, but you chose me. You saw a vulnerable woman and you thought that made me weak. You all did." I opened the urn and tilted it, letting the wind catch the ashes and carry them out to sea. I hope you understand now. I hope somewhere in those last years, through the fog of medication and confusion, you realized what you'd lost. Not me, you never deserved me, but your freedom, your future, your very self. You tried to take everything from me, so I took everything from you. That's justice. The last of the ashes scattered into the wind, disappearing into the gray sky. Goodbye, Marcus. I hope wherever you are now, you finally found the truth you were always too blind to see. That actions have consequences, and some people refuse to be victims. I drove home to my family, to the life I'd built from the ashes of my first one, to the happiness I'd fought for and earned. That night, I gathered all 4 of my children around me. Sophie, now 27 and a lawyer, Lucas, 23 and a social worker, Emma and Ella, 20, studying medicine and engineering respectively. "I want to tell you a story," I said, about a girl who was treated terribly by her family, who was almost destroyed by people who should have loved her, and who found the strength to save herself. And I told them everything. Not the part about being reborn, that was my secret to keep, but everything else. The abuse, the con, the revenge, the justice. They listened in stunned silence, and when I was done, Sophie was the first to speak. "Mom," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You're the strongest person I've ever known." Lucas nodded. "What you did, standing up for yourself, making sure they couldn't hurt anyone else, that's what I try to teach my clients. That they deserve better. That they don't have to accept abuse." Emma and Ella hugged me from both sides. "We're so lucky to have you," Emma whispered. "No," I said, pulling all 4 of them close. "I'm the lucky one. You 4 are my real family. You're what I was fighting for all along, the chance to build something good, something pure, something full of love. And look what we made together." We stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, a family forged not by blood but by choice, by love, by the deliberate decision to be better than what came before. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I stood in my home office, looking at a photograph I kept in my desk drawer. It was the only picture I had from my first life, one I'd found tucked in an old album in a storage unit I'd rented under a false name in my second life. It showed a younger me, standing next to Marcus at our wedding. I looked happy but fragile, like a strong wind could blow me away. He looked confident, handsome, and secretly triumphant, because he'd known even then what he was planning. I studied that girl in the photo, the one who'd loved and trusted and paid for it with everything she had. The one who'd been so desperate to be loved that she'd walked willingly into a trap. "You didn't deserve what happened to you," I told her softly, "but you survived it. And you came back stronger. You saved me. You saved all of us." I struck a match and held it to the corner of the photo, watching as the flames consumed the image. The smoke curled up toward the ceiling, carrying away the last remnant of that first tragic life. When the photo was nothing but ashes, I swept them into my palm and walked to the window. I opened it and let the night wind take them, scattering them into the darkness. Rest now, I whispered. It's over. We won. And in that moment, standing in my beautiful home, surrounded by people who loved me, finally free from the ghosts of my past, I felt something I'd never experienced in my first life and had fought desperately to achieve in my second: peace. True, complete, unshakable peace. The girl I'd been was gone. The woman I'd become had triumphed. And the family I'd built, the one I'd chosen and created with deliberate love, was my legacy. Not revenge, not justice, not victory over my enemies, but love. Real, unconditional, transformative love. That was the best revenge of all, because while Marcus died alone and confused, while Victoria lived in poverty and obscurity, while my parents died bitter and resentful, I had lived. I had truly, fully, joyfully lived. And I would continue living, every day a testament to my strength, every moment with my family a celebration of survival, every breath a declaration that I had refused to be broken. They had tried to destroy me, to make me nothing. Instead, I had destroyed the version of myself they'd wanted me to be and built someone new, someone stronger, someone who knew her worth and wouldn't settle for less. I was Lily Patterson, mother of four, successful businesswoman, survivor, fighter, winner, and I was free.